I had a family member contact me saying they had a blower that was running one day but wouldn't start the next day. Now this is not normal. Typically there would be months between the last time it was used and when it wouldn't start, or it happens to stop on you while you were using it. I hate to say it, but this one almost stumped me and I had to go to the very extreme to try to figure out what happened to it. In today's video, we look at this Poulan Pro leaf blower, and the problem is that it started the day before, but it won't start today. Now, we need to keep in mind that an engine needs three major components for it to run, which is spark, fuel, and compression from the engine. However, this one is going to make us look at every single part until we've exhausted every possibility. Now, I'm going to try and repair this blower, however, it may not be the exact repair you need to make to yours. We'll explore other options later in the video. Now, we're only going to mention what these other options could be. We don't have enough time to look into them, but if you need more information on these options, you're welcome to ask as many questions as you need to. For this engine to start one day and not the next day, it would have to lose one of the major components overnight, which makes our job just a little bit easier. The reason is that it takes time for an engine to lose compression, so it's highly unlikely that's the issue. However, losing fuel and spark could possibly happen quite suddenly, so that's what I'm leaning towards right now. The first thing I want to do is confirm the problem that I've been told, which is that it won't start. What I plan on doing is putting some of my own fresh mixed fuel into the spark plug opening and then try starting it. If the engine starts and runs, it means we have a working ignition system and enough compression from the engine. Now if it doesn't start, we'll have to move on to the ignition system as a possible issue. Unfortunately, after pulling the rope about 20 times, it didn't start. The reason I kept pulling it as much as I did was because I was also trying to clear the engine if it happened to be flooded with fuel, and since it didn't even try and start, I don't think it was flooded. Now before I check for spark, I'm going to pour out the fuel and make sure it doesn't have any water in it. If it does, it means the engine isn't going to start because the water is preventing the fuel from burning like it's supposed to. After pouring out the fuel from the tank, it looks like it might be a little heavy in oil, but not by much. A little extra oil isn't going to keep the engine from starting, it's only going to cause it to smoke more than normal. I also don't see any water at the bottom of the jar, so I don't think there's any water inside the engine either. The next thing I need to do is check for spark by using a spark checker. Now to use one, all you have to do is install it in line with a spark plug and then pull the rope and watch for an orange glow in the tester. Now it's a bit easier to see in a shady spot, and seeing it on camera can be a bit difficult. I know it's tough to see on camera, so I've paused the video, that way you can see the orange glow in the tester, but like I said, using it in a shady area makes it 20 times easier to see. I do apologize for the grainy picture, but this time I went into the garage where it's much darker. That way the orange glow in the tester will be much easier to see. Unfortunately, since we have spark and fuel, the only item left to check is the compression from the engine. For this test, I'll be using a compression tester. So the reading is about 80 psi. Now this reading is quite low. A strong, healthy engine would have gotten a reading closer to 140 psi or higher, and an engine that had lots of hours on it would have been at least 100 psi. So is 80 not enough to run? The answer is 80 is more than enough to get a two-stroke engine to start and run. However, it will be down on power, but it should still run. So if we have all three of the major components, why isn't the engine starting? Now this spark plug was replaced in hopes it would help get the engine to start, so maybe it's defective. Now even though we have spark, maybe it's not getting inside the engine. To test out this theory, I'm going to put a known working plug into the engine and try starting it. Since we don't have any fuel in the tank, I'm also going to prime it with some fuel. So unfortunately, it still didn't start, and by this time, I'm getting very irritated that it hasn't even tried to start yet. Next, I'm going to use my drill to try and get it to start. Even though this blower isn't advertised to have a drill start, you can still put a socket on the nut that holds the impeller to the shaft and use it to turn the engine over. Unfortunately, it still didn't start. Now I'm getting really confused. If we have fuel, spark, and compression, why won't it start? The only thing I have left to consider is ignition timing. What I mean by that is that we could have all the spark in the world, but if it's happening at the wrong time, it won't matter. The bad news is that to check to see if the timing is off, we have to get down to the flywheel, and on this particular blower, it means we have to take it all apart. Now, the ignition timing is set by how the flywheel is referenced to the crankshaft, and this is accomplished by the flywheel being keyed to the crank. Now, if the key were to shear, the magnets on the flywheel would no longer be in reference with the crank, so the timing would then happen at a different time than it's supposed to. While I have the muffler off the engine, I can check the spark arrestor screen on the outlet. If the screen is clogged with enough carbon, it could keep the engine from starting. I know it's hard to tell, but this one is clear, so I don't think that's our issue. Another benefit to removing the muffler is that we can see the piston and its ring and what kind of condition it's in. Now there's one small problem. The ring should be shiny, but this one is dark with carbon and seems to be stuck to the piston because it's not moving. This would definitely cause our low compression issue. I also want to see just how much fuel was inside the engine. Now this will let me know just how flooded it was, which might explain why it wouldn't start. Now I know it looks like there's a lot of fuel coming out, but it's not as bad as it could be, so I don't think the engine was too flooded for it to start. I know I said we're going to get to the flywheel to check to see if the key was sheared, but if we have to, I am prepared to take the engine apart to inspect the piston and ring. I'm also going to check and make sure the bolts that hold the cylinder to the engine are still tight, because if they're loose, it could cause a massive air leak, which would keep the engine from starting. Now at this point, I can check the outer bolt, but not the inner one, and as you can see, the outer one is still tight. Not only that, but the cylinder is not loose, so I doubt the other bolt is loose. At this point, I'm ready to remove all the screws that hold the blower housing together. Now once they're all gone, we can get to the impeller so we can remove it and get to the 4 screws that hold the engine to the rear housing. I would recommend using a power tool to make this part of the job a little bit easier, and if you're worried about which fasteners go where and in what order, I would take pictures, notes, or do what I'm doing and film yourself taking it apart. Any of these methods will help you put it back together. Just be aware that the impeller should be able to spin before taking the nut off the shaft. When you're reinstalling it and after you put the nut back on and the impeller isn't free to rotate, it means something went terribly wrong during installation. The reason I know this is because it's happened to me before. Now once the 4 long screws have been removed, we can finally separate the engine from the rear housing. There's also a long spacer and a washer on the crankshaft you'll need to remove. The last part to remove are the ground wires that are connected to the ignition coil. So after all that work, I finally made it to the flywheel. Now this part here is where the magnets are located at, and when they pass by the ignition coil, it will then produce the current needed for the ignition system to work. There's supposed to be a certain air gap between the magnet and the coil for the system to work properly, and if the gap is too small or too large, it may not work. We know this one has spark, so I don't think the gap needs any adjusting. Next, we need to remove the flywheel and check on the key that's built into it. For this part, you'll need a puller or some other way to remove it. I would show an alternative method, however, there is a risk of damaging it. Now, the flywheel itself isn't expensive, but it's the crankshaft that's difficult to replace. After getting the flywheel out of the way, we can see the keyway in the crankshaft, and if the key did shear, we'd see what's left of it, but as you can see, the keyway is clear. That means the key is right where it's supposed to be, still molded into the flywheel and not damaged. That means the timing for the spark is happening when it's supposed to, and it's not the reason why this engine isn't starting, or at least that's the only thing I could come up with. Another reason why this engine might not be starting is that there's an air leak at the front seal. Now I know it looks dirty, but if this was an active air leak, there would be a lot of fresh oil around this area, but as you can see, there's none here, just some dirt, so I don't think that's the reason why it's not starting. Now that the engine is finally free, I can finally get an Allen wrench on the inner bolt for the cylinder, and as I suspected, it had not backed out and is still tight. Unfortunately, I am out of ideas as to why this engine is not starting. The last and final thing I can do is take the engine apart, mainly out of frustration, and check on the piston ring for a stuck ring. Now this really isn't going to prove much, and even if the ring was stuck, I already knew there was more than enough compression for it to run in the first place. The only thing I can hope for is that if the ring is stuck, I can free it, and this will increase the compression even more and finally get the engine to start. So what happens if the ring is not stuck? Well, the only thing I can do then would be to just replace the ring and hope the compression would improve to a point that the engine could start. After removing the cylinder, I can check on the amount of wear that's on it, and there is a fair amount of scoring on it, but it's not what I would call excessive. I might have to try and polish it if the ring needs to be replaced, but after getting out the piston, I can see that we have a problem with the ring. Now the ring is stuck tightly against the piston, which it's not supposed to be. After taking a closer look, it appears only a small part of the ring is free, while the rest of it is pretty much flush with the piston. I think that's the reason why the compression was so low. Only part of the ring was able to help seal the cylinder. If I can free the ring and clean the carbon that's keeping the ring from moving inside the landing, I think we can restore most of the compression, and it should be enough to get the engine to start and run. So the reason I think this will work is because if you look at my past videos, I've had to do this very repair on this style of blower more than once, and it's been successful. Now, I've tried several different ways to free the ring, but unfortunately, physically removing it is the best way, although using heat would be the other way I would do this job, and the reason is because it reduces the risk of breaking the ring. Now, the ring is not very expensive, however, I still don't want to go through the hassle of replacing it. Now, once I've freed the ring from the landing, I'll then carefully remove it, and then start to clean the carbon in the landing, which is what typically is keeping the ring from moving like it should and causing low compression. Now the best way to clean it would be to snap the ring in half and use the broken end to scrape the landing, but since I intend on reusing it, that's not going to happen. Now after several minutes of scraping and buffing, the piston looks a lot better and it's ready for installation. Unfortunately, this is where we have to leave the project, otherwise this video is going to be incredibly long. But in the next part, we're going to reinstall the ring and piston and then put the engine back together. Once the engine is mostly back together, we'll then perform a compression test and see if it's any better. If it is, we'll then reassemble the blower and do another test start. However, if it does not start, even after fixing the compression, I'm going to have to reach out to the viewers for other reasons they think might be causing it not to start. Hopefully that's not the case, but you never know. So in the end, I think we found out why the compression was low. However, that doesn't explain why it didn't start in the first place. If this doesn't work out, I might have to recommend that they just buy a new blower because this one might need to go to a real shop, and don't forget about real shop labor prices. Now after hearing that, I'm sure my family member will just end up buying a new blower instead. So my question is, do you think I'm going in the wrong direction, trying to find more compression, or do you think I might be onto something? Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.